In the quiet corridors of Westgate High School, one figure remained constant, unnoticed yet ever-present, the janitor Robert Bob Jenkins. For over 35 years, Bob had been the silent guardian of the school, ensuring the halls gleamed every morning before students arrived. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a friend, a mentor, and in many ways, a father figure to students who needed guidance. With his worn-out boots and an old denim jacket, Bob carried himself with quiet dignity. His weathered hands bore the marks of years of hard work, mopping floors, fixing leaking pipes, and scraping gum off desks. But what set him apart was the kindness in his eyes. He always had a smile, a word of encouragement, and a knack for remembering every student's name. Yet few knew the struggles Bob faced. His wife had passed away 5 years ago after a long battle with cancer, leaving him with mounting medical bills. His only son, Danny, had been a promising football player, but a tragic car accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. Now confined to a wheelchair, Danny relied entirely on Bob, who worked tirelessly to support his son's medical care. Bob never complained, never asked for help. He simply kept showing up every day, doing his job with pride. One of the students who noticed Bob's selfless dedication was Barron Trump. Unlike what many assumed, Barron was down-to-earth and observant, far from the privileged stereotype people painted of him. He had spent a year at Westgate High for a special leadership program. Watching Bob day in and day out, he felt a deep respect for the man who did so much but received so little in return. Barron had always been raised with the belief that true leadership meant serving others. Despite his last name carrying weight across the country, he preferred to keep a low profile at Westgate High, focusing on his studies and quietly observing the world around him. But it was Bob Jenkins who caught his attention the most. Every morning, when Barron arrived at school, Bob was already there, mopping the hallways before students flooded in. Every evening, when he left, Bob was still around, fixing something or making sure the school was ready for the next day. It was a routine Bob had followed for years, and yet nobody really stopped to ask how he was doing. One chilly November afternoon, Barron decided to follow Bob after school. He kept a safe distance, watching as the elderly janitor walked to the school's parking lot. Instead of getting into a decent car, Bob unlocked the door of an old, rusted-out 1987 Ford pickup truck. The vehicle wheezed as Bob started it, coughing out a thick cloud of smoke before rattling off down the street. It was clear Bob was struggling. That night, Barron couldn't shake the image of Bob driving away in that battered truck. His mind raced with questions. Why was Bob still working at his age? Did he have family to take care of? How could someone so dedicated be so overlooked? Curious and concerned, Barron did something he had never done before. He started asking around about Bob. The next day, he approached his history teacher, Mr. Anderson, who had been at Westgate for over 20 years. Mr. Anderson, can I ask you something? Barron began hesitantly. Of course, Barron. What's on your mind? Bob, the janitor. He's been here forever, right? Mr. Anderson smiled, leaning back in his chair. Oh, Bob? He's the heart of this school, son. Been here longer than I have. Always the first one in, last one out. Why do you ask? I see him working so hard. And I saw his truck yesterday. It looks like it's barely running. The teacher sighed, his expression shifting from warmth to something more serious. Yeah, it's a tough situation. Bob's had a hard life. His wife passed away a few years ago. Cancer. He spent everything he had on her treatment. That's awful, Barron muttered. And his son, Danny, used to be a football star here. Full ride to college. But then a car accident changed everything. Now he's in a wheelchair, and Bob's the only one taking care of him. The more Barron listened, the heavier his heart felt. So, he works just to support his son? That's right. No retirement, no vacations. He's just trying to keep going. Barron sat in silence for a moment. This wasn't just about an old truck or a hard-working man. This was about a father who never gave up, no matter how hard life got. And suddenly, Barron knew what he had to do. That night, Barron couldn't sleep. Bob's story haunted him. He had always been aware of privilege, But this was the first time he felt a deep responsibility to do something about it. Lying in bed, Barron thought about what he could do for Bob. A new truck? Maybe. But something inside told him this had to be bigger. Something that would truly change Bob's life. By morning, he had made up his mind. The next day at school, Barron pulled aside his best friend, Jake Reynolds, a fellow senior. "Hey, Jake. I need your help with something big." "Sure, man. What's up?" "It's about Bob. You know, the janitor." "Bob? Dude, everyone loves Bob." "What about him?" "He's struggling more than we think. His truck is falling apart, and he's working just to take care of his son. I want to help, but I can't do it alone." Jake's eyes widened. "What are you thinking?" Barron hesitated for a second before saying it out loud. "We're gonna buy him a new truck." Jake blinked. "Wait, what?" "I mean it. A brand new truck. But I don't want to just write a check. I want this to be something from all of us, the whole school. Bob has given so much to us, and it's time we give something back." Jake leaned against the locker, whistling. "Damn, that's actually an amazing idea. But how do we pull this off?" Barron had thought about this all night. "We start a fundraiser. We get the whole school involved, students, teachers, even alumni. We tell Bob's story. If everyone chips in, we can do this." Jake nodded slowly, the gears in his head turning. "Dude, this could work. And I know exactly how to spread the word." Within 2 hours, the plan was set into motion. Step 1. They created a GoFundMe page titled "A New Ride for Bob A. Westgate Thank You," explaining Bob's dedication, his struggles, and how they wanted to change his life. Step 2. They made a video, a heartfelt montage of students sharing memories of Bob, teachers talking about his kindness, and even old photos of Bob from decades ago. Step 3. They spread the word like wildfire. Social media, morning announcements, posters around school, and emails to alumni. By lunchtime, the whole school was buzzing. By the time school ended, something incredible happened. The fundraiser had already hit $8,000. Barron's heart pounded as he checked his phone. It's working. But this was just the beginning. By the next morning, something incredible had happened. The fundraiser had skyrocketed to $15,000 overnight. Barron couldn't believe his eyes. As he scrolled through the donations on the GoFundMe page, he saw names of students, teachers, alumni, even people from outside the school who had somehow come across Bob's story. Some donations were as small as $5, while others were as big as $500. But the comments? They were even more powerful. "Bob was like a second father to me when I was struggling in high school. He deserves this more than anyone." Jennifer L., class of 2009. "Bob always gave me advice when I needed it. I'm honored to help. Coach Ramirez Westgate wouldn't be the same without Bob. Let's get this man the truck he deserves." Mike D., class of 1995. Barron felt a wave of emotions rush over him. People genuinely cared. This wasn't just a fundraiser, it was a movement. During lunch break, Barron and Jake gathered a group of students near the football field to discuss the next steps. "All right, guys," Barron said. "This is growing faster than we imagined. We're already at 15 grand, but we need to keep pushing." A junior named Samantha Parker, who ran the school's social media club, raised her hand. "I can make this go viral. We'll create a TikTok and Instagram reel summarizing Bob's story, and I'll get everyone to share it." "Perfect," Barron nodded. Jake grinned. "And I talked to the football team. They're dedicating this Friday's home game to Bob. All ticket sales will go toward the fundraiser." A ripple of excitement spread through the group. This was becoming bigger than they ever imagined. By the time Friday rolled around, the Westgate High football stadium was packed. Before the game started, the announcer took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is about more than football. It's about a man who has dedicated his life to this school. A man who has taken care of every student who walked these halls. A man who never asks for anything in return. And now we have a chance to give back." The crowd erupted in applause, and Bob, who had been invited under the impression that he was just there to clean up after the game, looked shocked. He had no idea what was happening. Barron watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding. This was working. And when they revealed the total donation so far, the stadium went silent before bursting into cheers. $35,000 and counting. Tears welled up in Bob's eyes. He had never seen anything like this. But what happened next would change everything. Bob sat in the middle of the stadium, looking around in complete confusion. The roaring applause wasn't for the football team, the cheerleaders, or even a special guest. It was for him. Barron could see it. Bob was holding back tears, shifting uncomfortably as if unsure whether to believe what was happening. Jake nudged Barron. "Go up there, man. Tell him." Taking a deep breath, Barron walked toward the announcer's table, where the microphone was waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Barron's voice echoed across the field, "I think we can all agree. Westgate High wouldn't be what it is without Bob Jenkins." The crowd cheered even louder, and Bob's eyes widened. For over 35 years, this man has been more than a janitor. He's been a mentor, a friend, and a father figure to so many of us. Barron turned toward Bob, making eye contact with him for the first time. "And now it's our turn to take care of him." The entire stadium went quiet. "Bob," Barron continued, "we know about everything you've been through. We know about your son, Danny. We know you work tirelessly just to make ends meet. And we know you've never asked for anything in return." Bob looked down, swallowing hard. "So we decided to do something about it. A few days ago, we started a fundraiser to get you a new truck. One that won't break down every week. One that you don't have to worry about fixing all the time. And as of right now," Barron glanced at Jake, who gave him a thumbs up. "Thanks to everyone here, and thanks to thousands of people across the country who believe you deserve the best." He paused, taking a deep breath. "We've raised over $50,000. The stadium exploded with cheers. Bob's jaw dropped. His hands covered his face, his shoulders trembling as the weight of the moment hit him. Barron took a step closer, his voice softer now. "Bob, you're getting a brand new truck. Paid for, fully covered. This is our way of saying thank you for everything." The old janitor shook his head in disbelief, his eyes glistening with tears. Then, something no one expected happened. Bob, a man who had always held himself together no matter how hard life got, finally broke down crying, and the entire stadium stood on its feet, clapping, cheering, and some even crying along with him. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into a life-changing moment. But this was just the beginning. Bob sat there, completely overwhelmed. His hands trembled as he wiped his eyes, trying to process the moment. Barron walked toward him, microphone still in hand. "Bob, this isn't just from me. This is from every student, every teacher, every alumni, and even strangers who heard your story and wanted to help." Bob sniffled, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say. This is too much." The crowd cheered again, encouraging him to accept it. Jake stepped in. "There's more, Bob. You haven't even seen the truck yet." At that moment, the stadium lights dimmed, and a large LED screen behind the field flickered to life. The camera zoomed in on the parking lot, where a group of teachers and students had gathered. And right there, shining under the floodlights, was a brand new, deep blue 2025 Ford F-150 Platinum. The entire crowd erupted in cheers. Bob froze, his breath hitching. His old, rusted-out pickup had finally met its match. The new truck was a beauty, glistening in the night, equipped with the latest technology, leather seats, and a fully accessible ramp for his son, Danny. Jake nudged Barron. "Time to make it official." Barron turned back to the mic. "Bob, let's go check out your new ride." The crowd parted like the Red Sea, allowing Barron, Bob, and Jake to make their way down to the parking lot. With every step, Bob's legs felt heavier, his emotions threatening to spill over again. By the time they reached the truck, Bob couldn't hold it in anymore. His fingers traced the smooth, polished exterior. He turned to Barron, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Barron shook his head. "You do, Bob. More than anyone." Bob exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This is the nicest thing anyone has ever done for me. Jake grinned. And there's one more thing. Bob chuckled shakily. There's more. Barron pulled out a small white envelope and handed it to him. Open it. With trembling hands, Bob tore it open and pulled out a piece of paper. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression crumbled again. Jake leaned in with a smile. A full year of gas, insurance, and maintenance all covered. You'll never have to worry about it. Bob let out a half laugh, half sob, shaking his head in disbelief. You boys. You don't even know what this means to me. He looked around at the students and teachers who had gathered, then back at Barron. Then, in front of everyone, Bob wrapped Barron in the tightest hug he had ever received. The stadium erupted in applause. And for the first time in a long time, Bob Jenkins, the man who had spent his entire life taking care of others, felt what it was like to be taken care of. But the surprises weren't over yet. As the cheers echoed around them, Bob stood there, clutching the keys to his brand new truck, his emotions spilling over. But Barron wasn't done yet. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Bob's shoulder. There's someone else who wanted to be here for this moment. Bob furrowed his brows in confusion. Who? Jake grinned and gestured toward the truck. The passenger door slowly swung open. And there, sitting in his wheelchair, was Danny Jenkins, Bob's son. Bob's knees nearly buckled. Danny, son, how did you? Danny's eyes were filled with tears, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair tightly. Dad, I had to be here. I had to see this with my own eyes. Bob turned to Barron in shock. How did you? Barron smiled. I reached out to some people. I wanted to make sure he was here when this happened. Bob's hands covered his mouth, his whole body shaking. You don't understand. Danny hasn't been able to leave the house much since his accident. Our old truck wasn't built for his wheelchair. But this one has a ramp. Danny wiped his tears. Dad, I can finally ride with you again. Bob collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Barron, Jake, and the students around him felt their own eyes welling up. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. This was about giving a father and son their life back. Danny wheeled himself forward and wrapped his arms around his father. You've taken care of me all these years, Dad. Now it's time for someone to take care of you. Bob clutched his son tightly, his voice breaking. I love you, son. I love you so much. For a few moments, the world seemed to stand still. But then, as Bob slowly stood up, wiping his face, a new realization hit him. This wasn't just a truck. This was freedom. Freedom for him. Freedom for Danny. And just when he thought it couldn't get any better, Barron had one last surprise. The stadium was still buzzing with emotions as Bob and Danny held each other. The father's tears had not stopped, but now they were mixed with something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Barron took a step forward, clearing his throat. Bob, there's one more thing. Bob let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. Son, I don't think my heart can take any more surprises tonight. Barron grinned. Trust me, you're going to want to hear this. The LED screen lit up again, and a new image appeared, a check. Bob froze. His eyes locked on the numbers written on it. $100,000. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Bob stumbled backward, clutching his chest. No way. That can't be real. Danny's eyes widened, his hands shaking as he looked between Barron and his father. It's real, Bob, Barron assured him. After our fundraiser hit $50,000, something amazing happened. People started sharing your story across the country. Celebrities, former students, even business owners donated. And when a few major donors stepped in, we hit 6 figures. Bob was speechless. This isn't just for a truck, Barron continued. This is for you. This is for Danny. This is for anything you need to pay off medical bills, fix up your home, or even retire if you want to. Bob's legs buckled again, and Danny reached out to grab his father's arm. Bob looked around at the faces surrounding him. Students, teachers, friends, people who had cared for him when he didn't even know they were watching. His voice cracked. This This kind of thing doesn't happen to people like me. Danny squeezed his father's arm. Dad, maybe it should. Barron stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. Bob, you've spent your life serving others. It's time we give back to you. You've earned this. Bob covered his face with his hands, breaking down once more. Barron gave him a moment, then added, "And, if you're up for it, I'd love to take you for the first ride in your new truck." Bob chuckled through his tears, shaking his head. "I'd love that, son. I'd love that." And as Bob climbed into his brand new truck for the first time, with Danny by his side, he finally allowed himself to believe it. For the first time in decades, he wasn't just surviving. He was free. Bob ran his calloused fingers over the steering wheel of the brand new Ford F-150, his eyes still misty. The leather seats, the fresh scent of a new vehicle, the smooth hum of the engine. It all felt like a dream. Danny, sitting beside him in the front seat, grinned. "Dad, you look good in this truck." Bob let out a breathless chuckle. "I don't know, son. Feels too fancy for an old janitor like me." From outside, Barron knocked on the driver's side window, smiling. "Bob, you ready?" Bob nodded, gripping the wheel. Barron turned to the students and faculty gathered around. "All right, everyone, let's send Bob off in style." The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping and whistling as Bob put the truck in drive. The moment his foot hit the gas, he felt it. Freedom. The truck rolled smoothly through the parking lot, past the same school he had spent 3 decades cleaning, past the hallways where he had comforted struggling students, past the football field where he had once cheered for his son, past the place that had been his whole world for so long, and the place that had just given him a new beginning. As Bob reached the end of the parking lot, he glanced at Danny. "Where to first, kiddo?" Danny smirked. "Anywhere but home. Let's just drive, Dad." Bob laughed heartily, pressing down on the gas as they pulled onto the open road, the roar of the engine blending with the sound of the crowd cheering behind them. For the first time in years, Bob wasn't driving an old, broken-down truck that barely held together. For the first time in years, he wasn't just driving to survive. He was driving toward something better. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream again. But what happened the next day would be even more shocking. Bob awoke the next morning feeling different. For the first time in years, he hadn't woken up with aching joints from pushing a mop for 12 hours straight. He hadn't woken up dreading the long shift ahead, the worry of medical bills, or the fear of his truck breaking down on the highway. Instead, he woke up to the sound of birds chirping, sunlight streaming through the window, and Danny laughing. That was a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. Bob rubbed his eyes and shuffled to the living room, where Danny sat on the couch, phone in hand, grinning from ear to ear. "What's so funny, kid?" Bob asked, yawning. Danny turned the phone toward him, his smile growing even bigger. "Dad, you're famous." Bob squinted at the screen. His GoFundMe story had gone viral overnight. The video of his reaction at the stadium had been shared millions of times on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Celebrities, news stations, and influencers had picked up the story, calling it the most wholesome moment of the year. Even national news outlets were talking about it. Bob felt his knees go weak. "What? How?" Danny chuckled. "Barron and Jake weren't messing around. This thing blew up, Dad. Look at this. There are thousands of comments from people saying they were inspired by your story. Some are even starting their own fundraisers for janitors at their schools." Bob shook his head in disbelief. No way people care that much about an old janitor." Danny's smile faded slightly, his voice softening. "Dad, you've spent your whole life thinking you don't matter. But people see you. They see your heart, your kindness, the way you take care of everyone. And now, it's your turn to be taken care of." Bob sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand over his face. "This is too much, Danny. I don't even know what to do with all this kindness." Danny smirked. "Well, lucky for you, there's more." Bob glanced at him warily. "More?" Danny nodded and handed him an envelope sitting on the coffee table. "This came early this morning." Bob hesitated before carefully opening the envelope. His eyes widened as he read the letter inside. Then his hands began to shake. No, this can't be real. Danny leaned forward. What does it say, Dad? Bob slowly looked up, his eyes filled with tears. They're offering me a full retirement package and a paid-for-home renovation to make the house wheelchair accessible for you. Danny's jaw dropped. Wait, who's offering this? Bob held up the letter, his voice trembling. Westgate High School and an anonymous donor. Danny's eyes widened. Bob clutched the letter to his chest, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Everything he had ever sacrificed was finally being repaid. And as much as he wanted to believe this was the final surprise, there was still one more twist waiting for him. Bob sat frozen, gripping the letter as if it might disappear if he let go. Danny leaned closer. Dad, who do you think the anonymous donor is? Bob shook his head. I have no clue, son, but whoever they are, they just changed our lives. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted the moment. Danny wheeled himself toward the door and opened it. Standing there, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, was Barron Trump. Bob's eyes widened. Son, what are you doing here? Barron smiled. I wanted to check in on you, and I thought you deserved to know something. Bob gave him a confused look. Know what? Barron hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter. Danny glanced between them. Barron, what is that? Barron took a deep breath before handing it to Bob. This is the original letter Westgate sent you. But the anonymous donor, that part, that was me. Bob stared at Barron, stunned. The room went silent. Danny's jaw dropped. Wait, you. Barron nodded. I didn't want to say anything at first. I just wanted you to have it without any attention. But you deserve to know the truth. Bob's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter again, his eyes scanning over the offer. A full retirement, home renovations, and additional funds for medical expenses. All of it made possible by Barron. Bob looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this, son? Barron smiled. Because, Bob, I learned something from you. Bob's eyes filled with tears. From me? Barron nodded. You spent your whole life taking care of people who never even noticed. You did your job with pride, with kindness, with patience. You made sure every kid who walked through that school felt seen. You made a difference. Bob blinked back tears. Barron continued. I grew up in a world where people assumed everything was handed to me. But you showed me something different. You showed me what it means to work hard, to give without expecting anything in return. And I wanted to do the same for you. Bob's breath hitched. He looked down at the letter again, then back at Barron. Son, I don't know how to thank you. Barron smiled softly. You don't have to. Just promise me one thing. Bob nodded. Anything. Barron's expression turned sincere. Promise me you'll finally take care of yourself now. Bob let out a shaky laugh, nodding. I promise, son. And in that moment, standing in the small, humble house he had worked so hard to keep, Bob Jenkins realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a janitor. He was loved. But what happened next would take things to an even bigger level. Bob sat at his kitchen table, still trying to process everything. A brand new truck, a retirement package, home renovations, and an anonymous donation from Barron Trump himself. It all felt like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. Danny scrolled through his phone, shaking his head. Dad, this just keeps getting crazier. Bob rubbed his temples. I don't know if I can handle any more surprises, son. Danny let out a whistle. Well, you might have to, because guess who just tweeted about you? Bob froze. Danny turned the phone toward him. There, in bold letters, was a tweet from Elon Musk. Fire, the world needs more people like Bob Jenkins. Hard work, kindness, and humility. Finally getting the recognition they deserve. Let's make sure every janitor, teacher, and caregiver out there gets the same respect. Count me in to help. Hashtag Bob Jenkins deserves the best. Bob stared at the screen, unblinking. Elon Musk? He repeated slowly. Danny laughed. Dad, I don't think you understand. When Elon Musk tweets about something, it blows up. Bob opened his mouth, but no words came out. Danny scrolled again. Oh, and he's not the only one. Check this out. He flipped the phone again to show posts from celebrities and business leaders across the country. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Bob Jenkins is the definition of a hero. Respect. Let's change more lives like this. Someone get me in touch with him. Flexed biceps medium skin tone fire Mark Cuban. Honoring people who dedicate their lives to others. Love this story. Let's see how we can help more janitors and school staff across the U.S. Ellen DeGeneres. Bob, if you're reading this, expect a call soon. We need to talk. Winking face, Bob slumped back in his chair, his hands shaking. Son. What is happening? Danny let out a whoop, clapping his hands together. What's happening, Dad? Is that you just became a national inspiration. Just then, Barron's phone rang. He picked it up and listened for a few seconds before his eyes went wide. He hung up and looked at Bob. You might want to sit down for this one, Bob. Bob gave him an exhausted look. Son, I am already sitting. Barron grinned. Good. Because you and Danny are about to be invited to a national morning show. Bob nearly fell out of his chair. The next morning, Bob and Danny found themselves in an entirely new world. One of flashing cameras, makeup teams, and the bright lights of national television. Bob fidgeted with his tie, looking around nervously in the New York City studio of Good Morning America. Danny, dressed in a sharp blazer, grinned at his father. Dad, you're about to be on live TV. Can you believe this? Bob let out a breath. Son, I still haven't processed the truck yet. Barron, who had flown with them for support, patted Bob on the back. You got this, Bob. Just be yourself. Before he could respond, a producer waved them over. All right, gentlemen. You're on in 30 seconds. Bob gulped. The bright lights hit as the hosts of Good Morning America welcomed their audience. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an incredible story today. You may have seen the viral video of a high school janitor receiving the surprise of a lifetime. Well, this morning we have the man himself. Please welcome Bob Jenkins, his son Danny, and the young man who helped make this happen, Barron Trump. The crowd erupted in applause as Bob, Danny, and Barron walked onto the stage. Bob had to fight the urge to run the other way. The host smiled warmly. Bob, first of all, welcome. We all watched your reaction, and let me tell you, it had the whole country in tears. Bob chuckled nervously. Well, I'm still in tears myself. The audience laughed and clapped. One of the hosts leaned forward. Tell us, Bob, what was going through your mind when you saw the truck? When you realized what Barron and the students had done? Bob cleared his throat. I still don't have the words for it. I spent my whole life making sure those kids had a clean school, a safe place. Never once did I think anyone noticed me. And then, this happened. I'll never be able to thank them enough. The audience awed in unison. The host turned to Danny. Danny, we know your father's been through a lot. How has this moment changed things for you both? Danny smiled. For years, my dad has put everyone else first. I've watched him struggle, sacrifice, and never complain. Seeing him finally get the love he deserves? It means everything. A soft sniffle was heard in the audience. Then the host turned to Barron. Now, Barron, you could have just donated the money privately, but you took the time to rally the entire school, the entire country behind this. Why was it so important to you? Barron smiled. Because Bob deserved it. Simple as that. I've seen people like Bob my whole life, working behind the scenes, keeping the world running, never asking for anything. I just wanted to make sure he knew how much we appreciate him. The audience erupted in applause again. The host smiled warmly. Well, Bob, this has been an incredible journey. But before we let you go, we have just one more surprise. Bob's stomach dropped. More. The host grinned. Bob, remember how we mentioned that your story inspired people across the country? Bob nodded cautiously. The screen behind them lit up. The camera zoomed in on a video call, featuring janitors from over 50 schools across the country. Bob's breath hitched. One by one, the janitors began speaking. Bob, your story changed my life. My school just started a new program to help staff like me retire earlier. Because of you, my students just started a janitor appreciation fund at our school. You showed the world that we matter, Bob. Thank you. Tears streamed down Bob's face. The host smiled. Bob, you didn't just change your own life. You changed the lives of janitors, school staff, and unsung heroes everywhere. Bob wiped his face, his voice breaking. I don't know what to say. The host reached over and patted his hand. You don't have to say anything, Bob. Just know that you are loved, and that the whole country is standing behind you. The audience gave a standing ovation, cheering as Bob bowed his head, overwhelmed with gratitude. And as the cameras faded to commercial, Bob realized something. He had spent his entire life in the background, but today, he was finally seen. The morning after their Good Morning America appearance, Bob and Danny were still adjusting to their newfound fame. Their phones hadn't stopped buzzing since the interview aired, and their inboxes were filled with messages from people all over the country. Bob sat in his hotel room, staring out the window at the New York City skyline, still struggling to believe that all of this was happening. Danny, scrolling through social media, chuckled. Dad, you've officially gone viral. Again. Bob sighed, shaking his head. I'm just a janitor, son. I don't understand why the whole world cares so much. Danny set his phone down, his expression turning serious. Dad, you were never just a janitor. You were a role model. People see that now. Before Bob could respond, Barron walked into the room, his face unreadable. Bob, you're about to get the most important phone call of your life. Bob blinked. Son, I don't think my heart can take another surprise. Barron smirked. Well, you don't have a choice. Just then, Danny's phone rang. Danny glanced at the screen, his eyes widening. Dad? You might want to sit down for this one. Bob sighed and plopped onto the bed. All right, kid. Who is it now? The Pope. Danny turned the phone toward him, his hands shaking. On the screen, the caller ID read, White House. Bob's entire body went still. Danny slowly answered and put the phone on speaker. Hello. A smooth, professional voice responded. Good morning. This is the White House calling on behalf of the President of the United States. May I speak with Mr. Robert Jenkins? Bob's mouth went dry. Danny nudged him. Dad, say something. Bob swallowed hard. This is Bob? The voice on the other end remained warm and professional. Mr. Jenkins, the President has personally followed your story and would like to invite you to the White House to honor your contributions to your community. Bob gasped. Danny yelped in excitement. Barron grinned. The White House official continued. If you accept, we will arrange all travel accommodations for you, your son, and any guests you wish to bring. The President would like to personally recognize you for your lifetime of service. Bob pressed a hand to his chest, struggling to breathe. I don't even know what to say. The official chuckled. A simple yes would do, sir. Bob let out a breathless laugh. Then I guess yes. Danny cheered, pumping his fist in the air. Dad, you're going to the White House. Bob ran a shaky hand through his hair, his mind spinning. A week ago, he had been mopping floors in a high school. Now, the President of the United States wanted to meet him, and he had no idea what was coming next. 3 days later, Bob, Danny, Barron, and Jake found themselves stepping off a private jet at Andrews Air Force Base. The sun shone brightly over Washington, D.C., but nothing could outshine the excitement and disbelief on Bob's face. As soon as they touched down, a fleet of black SUVs awaited them. Bob adjusted his collar nervously. Son, I don't belong in a place like this. Danny laughed. Dad, that's exactly why they invited you. Because you do. The Secret Service escorted them straight to the White House. As they drove past the iconic front lawn, Bob's heart pounded. The whole thing felt like an out-of-body experience. As they pulled up to the White House entrance, a well-dressed official greeted them. Mr. Jenkins, it's an honor to have you here. The President is eager to meet you. Bob wiped his hands on his pants, nerves taking over. Son, I ain't cut out for fancy meetings. Barron grinned. Bob, you've spent your life teaching kids to believe in themselves. Now it's time to believe in yourself. Bob nodded hesitantly as they followed the official inside. The White House was even grander in person. Chandeliers hung from the ceilings, historic paintings lined the halls, and staff members smiled as they walked by. Bob's eyes darted around, completely overwhelmed. Then suddenly they were led into the Oval Office. And standing there waiting for him was the President of the United States. Bob felt his legs go weak. The President stepped forward with a warm smile and extended his hand. Mr. Jenkins, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. Bob swallowed hard, wiping his palm on his pants before shaking the President's hand. Sir, I don't even know what to say. The President chuckled. Well, you've already said plenty through your years of service. It's about time someone says, thank you properly. Bob's eyes welled up. Danny beamed with pride. Dad, you're a big deal now. The President gestured toward a chair. Please sit. We have something important to discuss. Bob hesitated but slowly sat down. Barron and Jake exchanged curious glances. The President leaned forward, his expression turning serious. Mr. Jenkins, your story has inspired millions across the country. You've reminded us of the unsung heroes, the janitors, the teachers, the cafeteria workers, who keep our schools running and shape our children's lives. Bob stayed silent, unsure of where this was going. The President continued. Because of you, we've seen a nationwide movement to support school staff. And today, I want to make it official. Bob blinked. Official? The President smiled. Bob, today I am signing an executive order that establishes the Bob Jenkins Initiative, a new program dedicated to increasing wages, benefits, and retirement support for school janitors and staff across the country. Bob's jaw dropped. Danny let out a shocked laugh. Dad, did you just change history? The President chuckled. Yes, he did. The room erupted in applause. Barron clapped, Jake whistled, and Danny wiped a tear from his eye. Bob buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed. Sir, I was just doing my job. I never expected anything like this. The President nodded. That's exactly why you deserve it. A White House staff member brought over a document, and the President took out his pen. With one signature, Bob's legacy was cemented into American history. He had gone from cleaning the halls of a high school to inspiring an entire nation. And as the President shook his hand one more time, Bob finally realized something. He wasn't just seen, he was heard. But the surprises weren't over yet. After the historic signing of the Bob Jenkins Initiative, Bob thought the surprises were finally over. He was wrong. As they left the Oval Office, a White House staffer approached them with an urgent message. Mr. Jenkins, the President has one more request. Bob furrowed his brows. More? Son, my heart can't take much more of this. The staffer smiled. Sir, the President would like you to join him at a special congressional session this afternoon. Members of Congress want to personally thank you. Bob froze. Danny grinned. Dad, you're about to walk into the United States Capitol as a guest of honor. Bob ran a shaky hand over his face. What in the world is happening to me? The U.S. Capitol. Hours later, the Capitol building was even more overwhelming than the White House. Bob, Danny, Barron, and Jake walked down the long hallways, surrounded by aides and security. When they reached the chamber, a crowd of senators and representatives stood waiting. A congressional aide stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Robert Jenkins. The room erupted in applause. Bob stumbled back, stunned. He had never heard so many important people cheering for him. Danny leaned in. Dad, you just got a standing ovation. In Congress. Bob blinked rapidly, struggling to hold back his emotions. Then, the Speaker of the House took the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a man who represents the best of us. Hard work, humility, and selflessness. Mr. Robert Jenkins has spent his life serving students, shaping futures, and giving without expecting anything in return. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. The Speaker continued. Because of his incredible dedication, We are proud to introduce the Bob Jenkins Act, which will provide increased federal funding to ensure fair wages and retirement benefits for school custodians across the country. Bob staggered back, gripping his chest. Danny grabbed his father's arm. Dad, you just changed the law. The room erupted in applause again. Barron patted Bob on the back. Told you, Bob. You're a legend now. Bob shook his head in disbelief. All I ever wanted was to take care of my school. I never thought the whole country would take care of me in return. The speaker smiled. Mr. Jenkins, would you like to say a few words? The room fell silent. Bob's heart pounded. He had never spoken in front of more than a classroom full of kids, and now he was about to address the U.S. Congress. He swallowed hard, stepping up to the podium. He took a deep breath and looked out at the powerful leaders before him. Then, with a steady voice, he said, I'm just a janitor. But today, I finally understand something. I was never just anything. The room erupted in applause. And as Bob stepped back from the podium, he realized that he had done something no one could have ever expected. A high school janitor had just changed the lives of millions. As Bob stepped away from the congressional podium, the entire chamber remained on their feet, clapping, cheering, and even wiping away tears. The former janitor from Westgate High School had just left the most powerful people in the country speechless. Danny grinned as he wheeled up next to his father. Dad, that was the best speech I've ever heard. Bob let out a shaky breath, wiping his eyes. Son, I don't even know what just happened. The Speaker of the House stepped forward, smiling. What just happened, Mr. Jenkins? Is that you changed history? Bob shook his head. I don't know about that. I was just doing my job. The speaker chuckled. That's exactly why people like you deserve to be recognized. A congressional aide stepped in, holding a framed certificate. Mr. Jenkins, this is an official declaration from Congress, recognizing your decades of service and your contributions to education. Bob stared at the document, his eyes misting again. Danny nudged him. Dad, you just got a law named after you. That's a little bigger than just mopping floors. Bob let out a breathless chuckle. Barron walked up and put a hand on Bob's shoulder. This is only the beginning. Bob turned to him, confused. What do you mean, son? Barron smiled. Because we're not done yet. Bob stiffened. What now? Am I about to find out they're putting my face on a coin? The room erupted in laughter. But Barron's next words made Bob's knees weak. Bob, you're getting your own foundation. Bob blinked. What? Danny's jaw dropped. Wait, are you serious? Barron nodded. Thanks to a group of donors, we're launching the Bob Jenkins Foundation, a nonprofit that will provide financial aid, scholarships, and emergency funds for school janitors and staff across the country. Bob staggered back, gripping his chest. A foundation? In my name. Barron smiled. That's right. No more struggling janitors living paycheck to paycheck. No more school workers being overlooked. Your story inspired a movement, Bob. And now we're making sure your legacy lasts forever. Bob leaned on Danny's wheelchair for support. Son, this is too much. Danny grabbed his dad's hand. No, Dad. This is exactly what you deserve. The speaker stepped in again. And just to make it official, the federal government will be providing an initial grant to help fund the foundation. Bob felt his breath hitch. Danny looked up at his father, grinning. Dad, you just became the most important janitor in history. Bob laughed through his tears, shaking his head. I was never important. I just did my job. The Speaker of the House smiled. Bob, you just proved to the world that the people who just do their jobs are often the most important of all. The room exploded in applause once more. And as Bob stood there, surrounded by leaders, celebrities, and his own son, he realized something. His life's work was no longer just about keeping a school clean. It was about changing lives. And he had only just begun. But there was still one final surprise waiting for him. Would you like me to continue with part 18? A homecoming like no other after an unforgettable week in Washington, D.C., where Bob had met the president, addressed Congress, and learned about his own foundation. He and Danny were finally headed back home to Westgate. But little did they know, another surprise was waiting for them. As their plane touched down at the small local airport, Bob stretched his arms and sighed. "Son, I don't care how many fancy places we visit. Nothing beats home." Danny chuckled. "Well, Dad, I think home is about to look a little different." Bob furrowed his brows. "What do you mean?" Danny just smirked. "You'll see." The moment they stepped out of the airport doors, Bob froze. Standing outside was a massive crowd. Students, teachers, parents, local officials, and people from all over town. A giant banner stretched across the street, reading, "Welcome home, Bob Jenkins, our hometown hero." Bob's eyes widened. What in the world? The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Kids held up signs. "Thank you, Bob. Our janitor, our hero. Bob for president." That one made him laugh. Danny nudged him. "Dad, I think you might be more famous than the president right now." Before Bob could even process it, the mayor of the town stepped forward, holding a plaque. "Bob Jenkins, it is my honor to officially declare today as Bob Jenkins Day in Westgate." The crowd exploded in cheers. Bob staggered back, covering his mouth. Danny grinned. "Dad, they made a holiday for you." Bob shook his head, laughing through his tears. This can't be real. But it was. And then, Barron stepped forward, holding a set of brand new house keys. Bob's brows furrowed. "Son, what are those?" Barron smiled. "Your home, Bob, the one you've lived in for years, has been fully renovated. Danny's got a brand new accessible space, the kitchen's been remodeled, and you'll never have to worry about another leaky pipe again." Bob's legs nearly gave out. Danny squeezed his hand. "Dad, they fixed the house for us." Bob looked around, taking it all in. The smiling faces, the cheering kids, the warmth of his community. And for the first time in his entire life, Bob Jenkins truly understood something. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a symbol of kindness, hard work, and resilience. And now, for the first time ever, he was home, without a single worry in the world. But just when he thought the surprises were over, one final twist would leave him in tears all over again. Bob stood in the middle of the massive crowd, overwhelmed with emotion. His entire town had come together to celebrate him. A man who had spent his life working in the background, never expecting to be noticed. And yet, here he was. Danny was beaming, rolling his wheelchair beside his father. "Dad, this is the best day ever. I mean, we have a Bob Jenkins Day now." Bob let out a breathless chuckle. "Son, I don't even know what to do with myself anymore." Barron stepped up, grinning. "Well, Bob, you might want to sit down for this one." Bob narrowed his eyes. "Son, if you tell me there's another surprise, I might just pass out." Jake smirked. "Oh, this is a big one." The mayor took the microphone again, clearing his throat. "Folks, we're not done yet. We have one more announcement. One that will cement Bob Jenkins' legacy forever." Bob sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lord have mercy. What now?" The crowd hushed. Then, the mayor turned and pointed toward the school down the street. A large curtain covered the side of the building. The mayor smiled. "Bob, it's time for you to see just how much you mean to us." A group of students and teachers pulled the rope, unveiling what was underneath the curtain. And Bob's heart stopped. Because right there, on the side of the building he had spent 35 years cleaning, were 4 massive words, carved into stone. Jenkins High School. The crowd erupted into cheers. Bob staggered backward, gripping his chest. Danny's eyes widened. "Dad, they renamed the school after you." Bob shook his head in disbelief. No, that can't be real." Barron grinned. "It's real, Bob. This isn't just Westgate High anymore. From now on, it's Jenkins High School, named after the man who gave it his heart and soul." Tears poured down Bob's face. Danny wheeled forward, grabbing his father's hand. "Dad, you made history." The mayor stepped closer, placing a hand on Bob's shoulder. "For years, Bob, you made sure the school was a home for thousands of students. Now your name will be here forever, so future generations will know about the man who made it special. Bob covered his face, overcome with emotion. The entire town chanted his name. B.O.B. Bob. Bob. Danny leaned in, smiling through his own tears. Dad, you'll never be forgotten. Bob wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. Then, for the first time since this journey began, he stood tall, looked out at the people who loved him, and finally accepted it. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a legend. But there was still one last thing left to do. The sun began to set over Jenkins High School, casting a golden glow over the newly unveiled sign. The air buzzed with excitement, cheers still echoing in the background. Bob Jenkins stood at the heart of it all, his name now etched into history. For a man who had spent his whole life in the background, it was almost too much to take in. Danny wheeled beside him, watching his father's face with admiration. Dad, you okay? Bob sniffled and nodded. Yeah, son. I just never thought I'd see a day like this. Barron stepped forward, holding something in his hand. Bob, I have one last thing for you. Bob groaned playfully. Boy, if this is another surprise, I swear. Barron grinned and handed Bob a small, polished plaque. Bob read the words slowly. Robert Bob Jenkins. A life of service. A legacy of love. For every student who walked these halls. He made them feel at home. Bob exhaled sharply, gripping the plaque. Barron placed a hand on his shoulder. This will be hung in the school lobby permanently. Every kid who walks into Jenkins High School will know your story. Bob closed his eyes, letting the moment sink in. He had never cared about recognition. He had never asked for anything in return. And yet, somehow, the world had noticed him anyway. The crowd began to chant again. Speech! 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 Bob chuckled, shaking his head. Then, he did something he never thought he'd do. He took the microphone. The crowd fell silent. Bob took a deep breath and spoke. I spent my life believing I was invisible. I never thought people saw me. But now I know the truth. He looked out at the familiar faces. The teachers, the students, his son, Barron, Jake, and the town that had raised him. Kindness isn't about being noticed. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. And today, you all proved that kindness never goes unnoticed forever. The crowd erupted in applause. Bob looked down at Danny, eyes shining. I don't need my name on a school. I don't need fancy awards or TV interviews. All I ever needed was to know that I made a difference. He smiled, wiping his eyes. And thanks to all of you, I know I did. The crowd rose to their feet, cheering louder than ever. Bob laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. And as he stood there, an ordinary man who had become a legend, he realized something for the first time in his life. He hadn't just made a difference. He had changed the world.